Darby Saxbe, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, so to begin, maybe let's start off with a little bit of introduction of who you are and like what type of work you're known for. So maybe let's start with what type of writing are you known for on Substack, for example?
Sure. Yes. So I'm a professor of psychology. I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. I run a lab at the University of Southern California. On Substack, I write Natal Gazing, which is a Substack that is devoted to all kinds of things I'm interested in, including pronatalism, the birth rate, pronatalism, the birth rate, progressive politics, the parenting brain, and gender roles and relationships.
Yeah, and I will say that this interview was quite a heavy lift for me. Maybe I'll start by giving a bit of an anecdote. Maybe this was like three or four, this was several months back where I was talking with one of the listeners of my podcast who is also a friend of mine, and I asked him, "Oh, what's your favorite episode of mine?" And this was like several months ago before I had done some of the interviews that I've done since then. And so he said that his favorite episode is like your inevitable future Lyman Stone episode. And I was like, no, no, besides that, what's your actual favorite episode of mine? And then he just said, my second favorite episode of yours is like your future Darby Saxbe episode. Um,
Wow. Who was this brilliant listener?
his name is Kevin McMichael. He actually writes a Substack. I might link it in the show notes.
Oh, great. Okay. I need to start reading it clearly.
Yeah. Um, so there, maybe let's start with an anecdote from you because you have a pretty fascinating backstory, which I think is part of the reason why I'm so fascinated in hearing what you have to say about fatherhood and gender roles. Could you talk about how it felt to see your parents go through a divorce as a kid?
Yes, definitely. So, yeah, I write about this in the book. I was kind of raised by a half-time single dad. So, when I was 9, my parents got divorced. My mom actually fell in love with the guy who became my stepdad. He was an English professor and poet at Oberlin College. I'm from small college town, Oberlin, Ohio. And so she took off. She left. She moved out, and my dad got sole custody of me and my brothers and my sister at first. So he was a somewhat checked out parent. He was sort of prototypical like 80s dad, like involved, but not the main hands-on caregiver. And all of a sudden he was the only person kind of running the show. And I watched him kind of undergo this transformation. He really stepped up and kind of became primary parent, the guy that cooked all the dinner, helped us with our homework, drove us places. And I sort of, watching him go through that kind of change and adaptation made me really interested in studying fatherhood in general. Ultimately, I did joint custody, so I was going back and forth between my mom's house and my dad's house for most of my adolescence. But I think I benefited from getting time alone with my dad and also time alone with my mom.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that really stood out to me when I was reading the advanced copy of your book that you were generous enough to give me is that like you felt a little bit more at home, you felt a little bit more relaxed when you were staying with your dad after the divorce compared to staying with your mom. Do you think that that played a role in why you're so interested in fatherhood in the present day?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think part of why I felt more comfortable in my dad's house is he was sort of like a more orderly person. And it was also the house that I'd grown up in. My mom ended up moving in with my stepdad.
Do you think
But
do you
yeah.
think your dad like seemed less demanding to you?
Oh, that's a good question. In some ways, like maybe less emotionally intrusive. Although my mom is like, she's not like a super typical mom. Like she's a doctor. She's very into science and research and is like loves reading sci-fi. Like in some ways, kind of more like the stereotype of what you might assume like of a kind of a nerdy man. Which is why she's, I think, really funny and really interesting to talk to, but she's not like a super nurturing, like, my whole childhood, I always had the fantasy that I would come home from school and my mom would be in a frilly apron with like a plate of cookies. And that was never like, that was never a reality. I think one time my mom did it as a joke. She made cookies and like was waiting for me at the door. And I was like, what is happening? This is too weird. So both my parents were a little bit unusual.
Yeah. So, but okay, maybe let's talk a little bit about the ways in which your father was like unusual? Like, so maybe let's keep expanding on this. Maybe you could expand a little bit more on A, the ways in which your father was unusual, and B, the extent to which that has caused you to care so much about fatherhood and what modern day scripts for parenting might be look like when it comes to dads.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was unusual about my dad is when he was a kid, he really liked helping his mom with cooking and baking. He grew up in Ohio in the 50s, and so he was the only boy at his elementary school to take home ec. All the other boys took shop, and so he was in there with the girls cooking and baking. But that said, like he was sort of a typical like, man of the 60s and beyond. And when I was really little, like when my parents were still married, I remember he would, he was very interested in genealogy and family history. He would sort of like go into his study at night and just like pore over, birth charts and census records. And was just kind of like that was his thing. And then once he was the solo parent, all of a sudden he's doing all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the grocery shopping, all the sort of day-to-day parenting. And so he became much more present. And actually really like, was a pretty hands-on parent ultimately, but with his own style.
What specific aspects of your dad's parenting style was something that you saw as aspirational and was something that you thought that like fathers in the present day could look to as like a role model?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, to me, like what's striking to me is just how much kind of like change he underwent to become a primary parent. That wasn't something that was on his radar as what he expected to ever do. And I think because the fatherhood role is so in flux in contemporary society, and a lot of couples are really actively negotiating roles and responsibilities. His kind of willingness to do that it is, I think, impressive and something that modern men could maybe learn from. But he was also like just really good at keeping order, and like he was never like a super yelly parent, but we just sort of had a willingness to do what he told us to do. I think because he was a pretty calm but very authoritative parent.
There's a quote from your book that I think is kind of illustrative. Maybe we can take it in this direction where you say,
Yeah.
quote, "Women are often raised to think of the motherhood role as a whole new identity, one that will reshape not just their everyday lives, but also their sense of self. But men don't always expect fatherhood to feel so consequential." End quote. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of little girls grow up being encouraged to play with dolls, kind of imagining themselves as future parents, future mothers, maybe even imagining what their wedding might be like. And I think we don't really socialize boys to be as oriented towards their sort of ultimate role in the family. And we also don't necessarily have a culture around fatherhood the way we do around motherhood. So when I became a mom, I joined a number of different moms groups. I signed up for Meal Train. I went to Mommy and Me yoga. I went to breastfeeding support groups. So I had all these kind of like resources and infrastructure around supporting my transition into motherhood, and became friends with lots of other new moms. And I think for men, we don't really have that same sense of occasion around becoming a new dad. And in part, it's because pregnancy is so visible for women, right? Like we can see the body changing right in front of our eyes. We, give up our seat on the bus for a pregnant woman. But for men, we don't necessarily know who's becoming a dad and who's not. And so I think it can kind of come as more of a surprise for men when all of a sudden they have a kid and their lives are reorganized around that. It's not necessarily something they grew up expecting that they were going to have to adapt to.
Yeah. What I will say is I do think that like within the culture more broadly over the past few years, there has been a lot more attention on like uniquely male experiences, like what it's like for boys to go through school, or like what it's like for teenage boys to like deal with the dating market, or like the your excellent book about fatherhood. And I think over time, especially over the past few years, I've just become incredibly grateful to the degree to which I would maybe like left aligned people have become a lot more sympathetic to talking about men's issues and boys' issues in a way that does not like reflexively cast judgment. And I think that in general, your book does a pretty good job. But did you see research when you were doing research for the book that indicated that there was a sense of like reflexive stigma or like a sense of like reflexing like rolling your eyes when it comes to like dads and the roles that they had in like family formation?
Yeah, I mean, I think so frequently men are raised to think of themselves as future breadwinners and not necessarily as really hands-on parents. And I mean, you see that even if you look at patterns in stay-at-home fathers. So about 20% of stay-at-home parents are fathers. But if you look at stay-at-home moms, when asked, why are you staying home? They will mostly say, in order to take care of my kids. If you ask stay-at-home fathers why they're staying home, they will give you lots of other reasons, like I'm working from home, or I've got a plan for a new business, or, and I think some of those reasons are very true. But I also think there's a little bit of a cultural stigma around men who are devoting themselves to caring for kids kind of above all other career goals. And to me, that's quite unfortunate because if we don't value caregiving and parenting in men or see it as worthy for men, then it's also harder for women to get support for it, right? It's just like becomes a kind of undervalued role or pursuit more broadly. But also because raising the next generation is one of the most critically important things we can do. I mean, I think of parents as like a natural resource. We need their energy to make sure we have a successful future workforce, successful future citizens.
What are some, okay, so like let's say that fathers are more hands-on with their children nowadays. There's a quote from I'm going to quote your book again because your book is filled with quotes. Um, Fathers aren't just male mothers. They have their own distinct styles of parenting, end quote. Could you talk a little bit about some of the distinct styles of parenting that you've observed from fathers and how that differs from that of mothers?
Yes, definitely. And you see this not just in human fathers, but even in primates that are biparental, where males take part in caregiving of children, which is our offspring, which is sort of a more playful, exploratory, risk-taking style of interacting with kids. So the prototypical sort of like tossing your toddler up in the air and catching them, running after them in a game of chase, tickling them, play that kind of stretches kids' limits and actually ultimately builds kids' confidence. And it turns out kids really benefit from that type of interaction. And it's linked with greater success in peer relationships, greater resilience to anxiety down the road, that like sort of father typical play. I mean, of course, I talk about this in the book as well, that not every dad is a playful dad and not every mom is a cuddly mom, right? Like parents play different roles that aren't always according to gendered scripts. And in fact, if you look at hunter-gatherer cultures, you don't see as much exploratory play coming from fathers, in part because they're not the sort of occasional fun parent. They're really like the everyday caregiver more often. But it's still, I think, like in our culture at least, we do think of dads as encouraging that boundary pushing play that is so beneficial for kids' development.
Yeah, and I am hopeful that we do continue to celebrate this sort of like boundary passing, like risk taking, maybe even like slightly more aggressive or like t styles of like parenting that fathers engage in. Because if we were to look at the way that, for example, like Richard Reeves might talk about how modern education systems sometimes treat boys like malfunctioning girls, I do think that there is a danger that if we are not sufficiently cognizant of the ways in which fatherhood parenting styles are at least somewhat unique and at least somewhat distinct, there might be a tendency within parenting to treat dads like malfunctioning moms and like not recognize the unique ways in which their parenting styles are beneficial. Do you think there is merit to this idea?
Yes, absolutely. I actually interviewed Richard Reeves for my book, and he was one of my favorite interviewees. And we talked about this idea that a lot of dads kind of feel like there's something wrong with them in the sense that they may not be bonding with the baby exactly the same way in the first few years, or they may not exactly gravitate to the same roles. And I do think we want to celebrate what dads are bringing to the table. It might be distinct from what moms are bringing. And in fact, there's plenty of research suggesting that it's good for kids to have attachment to more than one caregiver, and that moms and dads can complement each other. Maybe what you're not getting from mom, you're getting from dad, and vice versa. So I definitely think that thinking of fathers as sort of occupying in some ways unique and special territory that can sort of expand the kids' access to opportunities is a valuable frame.
Do you think this ties into the concept of maternal gatekeeping at least a little bit?
Yeah, I talk about this a little in the book as well, that a lot of men will report that they feel like mom gets in the way of their attempts to bond or interact with the kid. And, we just talked about exploratory and risk-taking play. And I think sometimes our culture of safetyism, which I think has kind of escalated in the last few decades, keeps us from putting kids in potentially risky situations. And that's not always actually great for kids developing confidence. And I think we're seeing an epidemic of anxiety disorders in part because of that. So, maternal gatekeeping essentially is like mom kind of interrupts dad's attempts to help or parent by saying, oh, you're giving our kid the wrong towel after the bath, or you're not doing the toothbrush song right, or you don't have the right things in the bag for the park. And it's a very natural impulse that if moms are frequently primary parents in the first couple of years, they feel like they have expertise and they want to tell dad what to do. But ultimately, it can make dads feel sort of pushed away from parenting and developing their own style and their own confidence. The flip side of maternal gatekeeping is also like male malingering, which also happens, which is sort of dads acting like, oh, I have no idea how to pack the diaper bag. And it's like, you're a fully competent adult. I'm sure you can figure out where the sunscreen tube goes. But I think both of those things can sometimes get in the way from dads participating as full parents.
Yeah. Okay, maybe this is a pretty neat, like you provided a pretty neat transition into my next question. You talked a little bit about like the sort of intensive parenting that exists right now. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the types of overly intensive parenting that you see mothers engaging in the present day.
Yeah, I mean, I think our culture around early childhood has become more protective in general. I think part of that is because of media. I think things like child abduction cases that got tons of publicity in the 80s and 90s kind of led to this greater hypervigilance. So, I grew up in the 80s in the Midwest. I would just like on the weekends go outside, find a neighbor to play with, knock on doors until somebody was available. That's an experience that's pretty unusual for kids today. Another reason is we have developed very car-centric neighborhoods where it's actually not really safe for kids to roam completely freely because, we don't always have safe intersections or sort of protected paths where kids can walk. We don't have third places that are comfortable and, friendly for kids to be solo. So I think our built environment has created this need for kids to be surveilled at all times, and social media has also exacerbated that, right? News media and social media, and the result is a lot of pressure on parents, and that worries me. Like the Surgeon General recently sounded the alarm about this a couple of years ago. There's an epidemic of parental stress, and that does not bode well for people's desire to have kids or for the outcomes of the kids that we're having.
Yeah. Okay, but maybe you talked a little bit about how you went and like just did like a lot of like unstructured just play without permission. Maybe that might be one specific area of parenting where it is better for parents to have the lower standards that they may have had back in the 80s and 90s compared to in the present, where in the present they're like too alert, they're too on maybe they're like afraid that like a stranger will randomly come in and kidnap their children or something, or even just like they're afraid of like extremely small details, like they're afraid of like bullying, where the definition of bullying has like massively ballooned such that some like formative useful experiences are now categorized as bullying. Would you characterize that as accurate?
Yes. Yeah. I actually wrote a Substack piece about this for the argument about a sort of misunderstanding at a roller rink, a roller skating party where a 9-year-old girl was briefly left alone. And, there was a miscommunication between the moms, and the mom was sort of furious and took to TikTok. And, how could my daughter have been left alone at the roller rink? She could have been kidnapped. And there was this huge pile on. And it's like I went to the ice rink or the roller rink all the time alone as a 9-year-old, around that age range. And nobody was lurking in the bathroom ready to grab me. Like we have a huge stranger danger fear, but actually child abduction is extremely rare. And most kids who are abducted by a family member, somebody that they know. So, again, I think this is where the media has just created this ambient fear around kids' safety that sometimes makes us more hypervigilant than we really need to be. And it can be to the detriments of kids' confidence and autonomy.
Do you think do you think the fear that people have about stranger danger is overblown?
I mean, if you look statistically at how likely your kid is to be kidnapped by a stranger, it's about the same percentage likelihood as being a conjoined twin. So, it's unusual. Which is not to say that we should let our kids like, I don't know, sleep under the underpass for, multiple nights in a row. Like, of course, we want to be sure that kids' physical safety is assured. Um, but I think sometimes our fear can lead us to adopt parenting practices that are draining and also robbing kids of autonomy. If you think about the fact that anytime you drive somewhere with your kid, you're at greater risk of harm than, if your kid is, let's say, alone in a roller rink. We drive our kids everywhere, right? Because we are living in these car-centric neighborhoods where we don't trust kids to walk from place to place. So we're already making childhood less safe in that sense.
Yeah. So maybe let's stay a little bit like at least a little bit more on the idea that there is like some kind of overly intensive parenting that mothers engage in that they don't actually need to engage in. Maybe part of the reason why mothers often engage in this like overly intensive parenting is because that type of parenting is self-policed and like they self-police it amongst themselves. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Definitely. Yeah. And in fact, there's some survey data suggesting that moms experience a lot of judgment from other moms. So there was a poll asking, who do you feel is judging your parenting? And moms rated that they were experiencing greater judgment from people around them than dads did, for almost every metric, including judgment on social media, right? Which I think is like, does make us kind of more aware of how our parenting choices are viewed by the outside world. So I don't want to sort of penalize moms or criticize moms for being, careful about kids' safety, right? That is the prevailing cultural tone right now. But I do think we could think about the roles of dads in maybe introducing some risk and exploration to kids' lives, and that can be a valuable, I don't know, antidote or complement to what moms are doing.
Yeah, and I will say
And moms can introduce risk too, of course. These aren't like gender deterministic, prescriptions.
okay. I will say I'm very glad that I'm very glad about what you just said about how it is often worthwhile to introduce some level of risk and exploration into children's lives and how dads do have the potential to potentially play a role in that. What are some other what are some other areas where you think fathers have the potential to play a greater role or like a greater contribution in like being a father that you think would be beneficial for their relationship with their family?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different ways that dads can show up in ways that benefit kids. And we know that across the board, when kids have more involved dads, they have better outcomes across a bunch of different domains. So, some of this just depends on dad's own interests and the kid's own personality. But in the book, I talk about frequently dads play the role of taking kids on excursions, camping trips. My husband did a big wilderness camping trip with our teenage son last summer, coaching sports teams, teaching kids how to drive. Like in traditional hunter-gatherer cultures, dads are also often in the roles of like teachers and mentors and guides. So all of those are really valuable functions that dads can play. And actually, one really interesting thing Richard Reeves told me when I interviewed him is that his brother, who lives in the UK, took paternity leave when his kid was a teenager. And that's something that you can do in the UK. And it's interesting to think about like what are the developmental windows in a kid's life where dads can show up and actually make a really special contribution. And adolescence might be one that we don't always think about or appreciate as much, but where kids can benefit from time with their dads.
Okay, so maybe to quote your book again, you said, fathers who took paid leave showed smaller increases in stress and sleep problems after their baby's birth, and their partners were less likely to get depressed. So I think I'm very glad that the mothers were less likely to get depressed when the fathers took more paid leave. Do we have testimonies about what the median father who did experience paid parental leave, what he thought about taking paid time off to care for their new infant, and like how rewarding did he find it? How rewarding would the median father find parental leave?
Yeah, it's a good question. And in my lab, we did a study where we looked at fathers who either did or didn't get access to paid parental leave. So the quote you just read was from results from that study, where we found that when dads were able to take some leave, not only did they show better trajectories of stress across the transition to fatherhood, but their partners had benefits also. And that's been that finding has been validated by other studies. For example, looking at like a leave, paternity leave reform in Sweden, where men were able to take more paternity leave. Prescriptions for antidepressant medications among new moms were actually lower. So again, sort of a mental health protective benefit of dads taking leave for the moms. In terms of what dads themselves report, a lot of Americans say that they believe in parental leave and paternity leave. Many dads don't take it either because they don't have access to it or because they fear stigma or sort of like repercussions at work from taking paternity leave. But the picture looks different in other countries that frequently have more generous policies around paternity leave. So a lot of countries, for example, in the Nordics have these like incentive nudge programs where the couple gets a certain amount of leave and some is earmarked specifically for dad. And if dad doesn't take that time, the couple doesn't get that time off. So policies like that sort of encourage dads to take more time off are actually linked with building more of a culture of fatherhood. And you see that in, for example, Sweden has the latte papas who are walking around with coffee cups and pushing their kids around and going to the park and forming like a society of fathers. And I think that's something that dads can really enjoy and appreciate and benefit from because they develop more confidence as caregivers of their kids.
Do you think an ideal level of parental leave would be equally long for both mothers and fathers?
Not necessarily because if mom is breastfeeding, she may need more proximity to the baby in the early months. And I think ultimately we should give couples some choice in the matter. So, different partners have different levels of career ambition and different incomes. Like sometimes mom is the person who has more career upside and wants to be back at work sooner. Sometimes dad is the person that wants to be, missing less work time at work. So I think it varies depending on the couple. But, I think like what the model looks like, at least in the countries that have the nudge programs, is dads are usually getting a few months out of like a total year or so that the couple is taking off.
What do you think are some of the main inhibiting obstacles that prevent modern day fathers from doing the best work that they can or providing the best contributions that they can to like the general life satisfaction of either the parents or the children in the long run?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of the things that can get in the way with dads. So, I mean, one might just be dad's own lack of confidence. So, we already talked about this idea that many girls are socialized to expect to be mothers in the future and even to sort of train for motherhood in terms of, getting practice playing with dolls or babysitting as a teenager. young boys don't necessarily get as much encouragement or as much experience with caring for young kids. So that's one barrier is like dads are going to need to sort of figure out the caregiving skills on their own, maybe without as much scaffolding as moms get. There's also, we talked about the workplace barriers like stigma, where, dads don't want to take a lot of time off because they fear that there will be career consequences. And then we talked about maternal gatekeeping. So moms themselves may, really cherish the maternal role and not want dads to take over, or may not trust dads to take over as parents. So I think there are a bunch of different sort of roadblocks that can come up for different dads at different times.
You know what? I'll just be honest. There's one specific topic where I was hoping that you would find a natural transition to it, but then you didn't, so maybe I'll just like hard pivot onto it.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about allocation of household labor?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that is a big lightning rod for a lot of couples. And we know that relationship satisfaction nosedives after the birth of the baby. And a lot of the time, division of labor issues are just like a big sticking point. So, we know that like women have really surged into the workforce in the last 50, 75 years, to the point where equal earner couples are the fastest growing share of couples. But for the most part, men have not fully caught up when it comes to housework and childcare. So women are still doing more housework and childcare, even when they are out earning their partners. And so that can be a source of frustration for a lot of couples. And often when dads are thinking about their own housework and childcare contributions, they might be comparing themselves to their fathers or grandfathers, by which token it looks like they're stepping up massively. Women might be comparing their husbands to themselves, by which token it looks like maybe the dads are not doing as much, right? So it's also like very much in the eye of the beholder. But, I think there are a lot of different ways that couples can resolve division of labor issues. I think one of the best things to do is just proactively talk about these things before a baby comes and the stress level is going to go up. So in my lab, we've been following first-time expectant parents across pregnancy and into the first postpartum year. And we actually have them come into the lab and talk about how they plan to divide up infant care. So they come in pregnancy, they talk about their division of labor, and then we bring them back when the baby's about 6 months old and they talk about how they're actually dividing up care. And we find that couples are somewhat poor predictors of what they think their division of labor is going to be. So they almost always anticipate a very egalitarian split. And when they come back, mom is almost always doing more. And some of that is just because she's, the one breastfeeding, and so there's more for her to do. But I think there are also some of the other roadblocks and barriers that we've talked about for dads, full participation.
Yeah, so part of the reason why I really wanted to talk about this topic is because this is the area where I have the most of it, like I have the greatest excuse to push back.
Great.
But that yeah, but like I'm thinking of like I could either take door A or door B, where they're both strong pushback against on this topic, but they involve me going in different directions. So maybe I'll start with
Maybe
door
we
A.
can take both. Yeah.
I'll start with door A to,
Okay.
well, I'll start by quoting your book again. Quote, for every single task we examined, from pets to childcare, the woman's share of cognitive labor was greater than her share of physical labor. Men did more execution and planning than their partners for just like I guess I'm not going to explain the card game, it would take too long. But basically they did more execution and planning for their partners just for taking out the trash. But even for garbage, women owned a greater share of the cognitive work, like remembering to buy trash bags and keeping track of trash pickup day, than the physical work, which is like hauling the bags out to the curb. Across the board, women were clearly in charge of the mental load. End quote. Could you talk about the concept of the mental load?
Definitely, yeah. So, as you said, this is something I talk about in the book, and it's based on a study that I did in my lab where we asked women, out of I think it was 30 different sort of common household tasks, how much of the execution of this task do you typically do relative to your partner, and then how much of the planning, anticipating, delegating, tracking of the task do you do? So essentially, like the cognitive or mental load piece. And as you said, for, every task we looked at, um, women were doing more of that mental load piece. And that really comports with sort of what we know anecdotally, and also with work from other researchers, like Alison Daminger, who has written about sort of cognitive housework. And we also found that when women were doing more of that cognitive housework, they reported more depression, more burnout, more stress, and less relationship satisfaction. So it seemed to be taking a toll on women's well-being and also on the quality of the marriage.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you that like cognitive work is associated with things like depression and burnout. Do you see that form of cognitive work, do you see that form of cognitive labor as a useful measure for understanding how much women contribute to the home as opposed to men?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an imperfect measure. A lot of the work on housework and division of labor is, I think, somewhat flawed methodologically, because it's actually like, without stationing ourselves in families' homes and really observing what's happening, we're relying on people to tell us what they're doing. And so a lot of studies use time diary data, which is like, could either be retrospective or, sort of experience sampling based, where you're pinging people and asking them what they're doing. But people tend to overestimate their own housework contributions. And I think that's true for the mental load piece as well. It's like, you're asking somebody how much time they're spending planning or anticipating something, but that's a little bit hard to quantify. I think that's one reason there's not a lot of great research on this concept, because it's just a concept that's tricky to measure.
Yeah, so your argument right now is that part of the reason why a lot of this methodology is flawed is because even if cognitive like work is a useful measure for understanding these things, we don't know how to measure it accurately. Is that the argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can ask people, which is what we did in our study, and get a decent signal to the noise. But I think it's not a perfect metric, right? Because we can't be inside people's heads to know exactly, who's sort of owning, the mental workload.
Yeah, so this is where I'm going to go even farther than you. I think
Yeah,
this is where the pushback comes in. Like,
great.
so the whole thing about how we can't measure cognitive work, we can't measure cognitive labor accurately. I agree, but I would go one step farther in that I don't think cognitive labor is really that useful of a metric for understanding how much someone actually contributes to the home. Like, imagine that like person like I'm gonna try to not make this example gendered, but imagine that there are two people. There's person A and person B, where person A is basically assigned to like sweep the floors and clean the floors and stuff, and they have like a broom and a dustpan, and they spend like 30 to 60 minutes um just like laboriously cleaning the surfaces of the floors to make sure that they're as clean as possible. And then person B just decides, you know what, I like decides that if this is something that they have to do on a regular basis, they're just going to spend several $100s buying like the most high quality Roomba they can, and just like getting an AI machine to do it for them so that they can spend those 30 to 60 minutes listening to their favorite pieces of jazz music from Snarky Puppy or whatever. Like person B, like even if they both contributed the exact same amount, person B did so in a way that like required much less cognitive labor because they were working smarter and not harder. Like I don't think that we should be using cognitive labor as like the best metric for understanding how much someone contributes to the home, because a lot of the time the things that are hardest for us to do are things where if we think about it a little bit more, if we get creative, we can do them in ways that are significantly less hard. What do you think of that?
Okay, so I'm going to push back to the pushback, because I see your
All right,
point.
fine, finally, fine.
But I think that you are sort of assuming that there are sort of hacks or ways to do tasks more efficiently if you're able to outsmart them. But I think when you're a parent who's running a household with small kids, there is a lot of sort of chronicity. There are a lot of tasks that are repeated, and there are a lot of pieces of information to track. So, for example, summer camps, right? Like, we live in a country where there is no sort of universal childcare situation. Kids can go to public school, but summer is this big open expanse of time, where if we are working, we need to find childcare. Researching booking summer camps is a major drag on somebody's time, because you have to figure out what's in your community, how many spots are available, when can you sign up? You have to fill out tons of forms. You have to figure out how to pay for it. Maybe you have to team up with other parents so that your kids have friends at the summer camp. I mean, that's just one example, but there's a mental load piece to that level of coordination, and you have to do it every summer. There's also, one good example of execution versus planning would be like around grocery shopping. So one person maybe goes out to the store to buy tomatoes because they're needed for that night's dinner, but the other person maybe is tracking the food preferences of everyone in the household, the recurring needs, who needs school lunch, who has decided they don't like tomatoes anymore, who will not eat lunch if they don't get a certain kind of, bread with their sandwich. And then I don't know who needs to bring a dish to the school potluck on Friday, right? And needs the ingredients for that. There's a lot of information that goes into those kinds of things. Even just like signing permission slips for school or making sure your kid is got the right stuff in their backpack for what they need for the school day. There are just like a lot of little pieces, a lot of sort of like bits of flotsam and jetsam that need to be tracked in order to run a smooth and functional household. And I think frequently with division of labor issues, the partners that is doing less tends to devalue the contribution of the person that's doing more by just saying like, well, why do you care about all this stuff? It's not that important. But in fact, like I was actually just talking to my sister about this the other day because her husband doesn't do much mental load stuff. And she's like, I'm always the person, if there's a birthday party on the weekend, I have to figure out how my kid is getting there, at what time, and buy a birthday present and wrap it. I was like, just stop doing that stuff. And she's like, yeah, but then my kid is going to miss the birthday parties that are, the only ways that they can see their friends on the weekend. So, I mean, there can be consequences to kids when parents are just fully checked out of that mental load. Yet it's still a wear and tear on parents' time and energy.
So after your parents went through a divorce and you alternated between going back to your mom and going back to your dad, which parent do you think, I'm not talking about like how much you preferred staying with them or how useful they were to you, but like which parent do you think invested a greater degree of like cognitive labor into parenting you?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, they were both pretty bad. So I was a pretty like autonomous kid. Like I remember I booked my own college tour and flew by myself to different places. I went to the travel agent and just like got plane tickets. And that's unusual now. Like I have a high school student and I'm like always thinking about her like college list and where she's applying. Part of it is our sort of like parenting style, like we've talked about, it has gotten so much more intensive sometimes in ways that aren't great. That said, I think the norm for parenting then was a little more neglectful in ways that also weren't great. So my dad honestly was more organized. So if there were school forms to be signed or things we had to bring, he was probably the person that was going to remember them. But I think it helped that when we were with him, there was no one else in the house. So he was the only point parent. There wasn't any diffusion of responsibility because that had to be negotiated.
So maybe he found it less stressful to be a single parent than it would be to like share co-parenting responsibilities with someone else, where he found it easier to carry all the responsibilities than to have to go through the stress of trying to like share it with someone else that might have different preferences from him.
Yeah, and I think that's actually not uncommon that a lot of people after a divorce say it becomes a little bit easier in some ways because rather than coordinating and negotiating with your partner, you just know that you have full ownership of every task.
Yeah. All right, give me a minute. There's like half a dozen different. Oh wait, I think I just thought of something.
Yeah.
So could you repeat the like a friend of yours like who has like a husband that basically devalues her work of like why do you have to like do all of this for your kid's birthday? Because if I don't do it, could you repeat that story?
Sure. Yeah. So I was talking to my sister about how she's doing all the kind of mental load in her house, even though she's the sole breadwinner. And she was telling me that, if there's a birthday party on the weekend, she's the only one that keeps track of what time it is, how her kid is getting there, when they need to get picked up, and the fact that there needs to be a present that somebody buys and wraps, like my sister does all of that. I said, well, why do you do it? Why don't you just like just let it go. If your husband's not willing to do it, just, forget about it. And she's like, well, it's the only way that my kid is ever going to have friends. So, there is a downside to a kid not being able to go to birthday parties with people from their class. It's going to be harder for that kid to then connect socially with their peers.
Do you think some of the cognitive load might be positively correlated with overly intensive parenting?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Does that suggest that like some of that cognitive load is unnecessary and or should not be necessarily counted for how much is a productive contribution to the family?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, but it's tricky, right? Because it's not just individual choice, it's also structural. So, if you're in a community in which I don't know, every single person is bringing an elaborate, beautifully wrapped gift to a birthday party, and your kid is the only person who shows up without a present every single time, your kid is going to get ostracized. Like, even if you decide it's not important and you don't care, your kid is the person that's going to have the consequence because that's your social context. So these things I think are determined more on a sort of group culture level than
Oh,
necessarily
this is
with
a
individual choices.
this is a collective action problem.
Exactly. I think all of it's like the over-intensive parenting in general is a collective action problem. It's like we've all decided that we're going to be hyper vigilant about kids' safety in ways that restrict their autonomy. And it's very difficult to be the one parent that wants a free range kid. Like if my kids were, roaming around the neighborhood looking for a friend to play with the way I was as a kid their age, no one would be home. Everybody would be at travel sports and um, classes and activities, right? Kids' lives are much more curated now. So the free range kid is going to have a harder time finding playmates.
So maybe if there's some degree of cognitive work or cognitive labor that like mothers often endure in a way that is causally related to the overly intensive parenting styles that are both unnecessary and sometimes even counterproductive. Maybe the goal is to see that type of cognitive work as like a necessary evil for the here and now, where like an ideal society is one where no one from either gender actually perceives it to be necessary.
Yes, to a point. So you're like anticipating my next book, which is called Under Parenting, which I still have to write, but it's about this idea of like how do we collectively decide to be less helicoptery with our kids. So I would say there's two different baskets. There's cognitive labor that actually does have to happen because, like, for example, we can't just like make dinner out of thin air, right? Like we actually have to know what we're going to cook, and we sort of have to know what people like, and we have to know that we're running out of something. Keeping track of what's in the fridge actually is like valuable cognitive labor. Knowing that we have to do the laundry every week or whatever it is, like knowing that we're going to run out of detergent. Those things are useful and important. There is also a lot of cognitive labor around parenting specifically that is probably overly intensive, not necessary, and that kids themselves could do if we granted them more autonomy.
I would say I would add a third category. So like maybe your first category is cognitive labor we need to do. The second category would be cognitive labor that we don't actually need to do. It's because of overly intensive parenting. I would add a third category, which is that is cognitive labor where there needs to be a certain output, but like it's possible to achieve that level of output with less effort if you outsource it. Either you outsource it to technology, you outsource it to AI, you can even outsource it to your kids. So maybe part of the problem is because a lot of this cognitive labor is a sort of thing where people, I would think disproportionately women, like self-police amongst themselves the idea that you need to engage in this cognitive labor where sometimes you don't need to do it, and other times there are ways that you can do it involving technology, like constantly like creating recurring reminders on your smartphone or telling your LLM chatbot to like do certain things for you where you don't actually need to do the cognitive labor that all the people in your friend group are telling you to do. Would you consider that accurate?
Yes, and it's interesting. There have actually been a lot of attempts to create what's called FamTech, which is like sort of technological solutions for managing cognitive labor, mental load. I know of a couple startup companies. There was one called Milo, which was developing sort of systems for parents to keep track of like special events at school and other things that required planning ahead. Um, there are also some smart calendars that have been introduced for families, like a big whiteboard calendar that you put in your kitchen so anyone can add reminders and you can all get pings and cues. So there have been some attempts to innovate in that space. I mean, it's interesting, right? Like Silicon Valley, for all that it is innovated, and for all that it is disrupted, has actually not done a ton of disrupting of household labor. And I think that actually reflects the sort of tunnel vision of some of the creators, like very few of whom have ever been primary parents or stay-at-home moms or dads. So, the joke is like Silicon Valley has created all this amazing technology so you can have a personal taxi for your burrito. But we actually haven't figured out things like, I don't know, solving for laundry. There was a New Yorker article about 10 years ago, like, why hasn't Silicon Valley created a better breast pump? Breast milk is like extremely time consuming to pump. Why haven't we innovated in that space, right? Like, and I think that does reflect a certain amount of institutional sexism on the part of the folks who fund a lot of the innovation, aka the venture capitals and angel investors who are disproportionately male.
Yeah, okay. There's so one of my past guests, Reagan Arts Gray, wrote a piece from a while back about like the allocation of household labor and stuff like that, where she cited some research. I don't know how you would interpret it, but it's like from the American Time Use Survey, which at least like her interpretation of it is that the total amount of time spent working is nearly identical for men and women if you include both like paid work plus household tasks plus childcare. I can send it to you if you're interested in it. But
Yeah, I've seen
basically,
that data.
yeah.
Yep.
So, mind if I quote her and then ask for your
Yeah.
response to it? Yeah.
Sure.
Quote, overall, it seems that both the data and my anecdotal experience suggest that in functional two-parent hetero families, both the father and mother contribute more or less equally in terms of time worked. It's just that the father's contributions are, on average, more tilted to bringing in money through external work, while the mother's contributions are, on average, more tilted to household tasks and childcare. I think the feelings of resentment that women have in the relationship come less from a sense that the burden of total work will fall unfairly on the mother, but from a frustration with how status is accorded to individuals within the family. Since mothers tend to do more of the childcare and household tasks, a larger portion of their efforts are spent on things that benefit everyone in the family. Fathers who do relatively more financially rewarding external work typically share the financial gains equally with the whole family, but keep the associated status mostly for themselves. Perhaps mothers fear they won't receive sufficient status for raising their kids into well-adjusted adults, or that they won't be recognized for the ways in which they've made it easier for their husband to succeed at work. End quote. What do you think of this sentiment?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's very interesting. I think there are parts of that that I agree with and parts that I disagree with. So, in terms of the time use data, it's actually a little more mixed than that summary suggests. So, we do know that in dual income couples with kids, which is really the important sort of slice that you want to look at if you want to look at division of labor issues, um, that there is a fairly significant leisure time difference between men and women. So, women on average get several hours a week fewer of leisure time than men do. And the time that they are spending, often that is coded as leisure, is what researchers sometimes call contaminated, which is to say that they're multitasking, they're engaging in different activities like watching a child while doing housework, for example, sort of like double activities. So there actually is a little bit of data. And if you look at also just like how often do you feel pressured by demands or rushed, feelings of burnout, a lot of those are higher in moms than in dads. So I think there still is actually a bit of a gender divide just in workload. The other thing is we know that when you have equal earner couples, both husbands and wives are making the same amount, which is the fastest growing slice of couples in the economy. You still see more housework and childcare being performed by women. The argument is men are spending more time at work, but it's a little odd because if they're making the same amount of money as women, why are they spending more time? So I feel like the numbers don't always quite add up. When you see couples where women are out earning their husbands, you actually continue to see women doing most of the housework and childcare. In fact, the only situation in which you get equal contributions to household and childcare are when women are sole breadwinners and their partners are not working at all. That's where you actually get the closest to a 50-50 split. I think it's when it's like, and I don't have all these stats right in front of me, so I forgive me if I'm getting some of the numbers a little bit wrong, but I believe that when women are making 80% of the income and men are contributing 20%, you are getting closer to egalitarianism. In couples where men are earning 80% of the income and women are earning 20%, women are doing 80% of the housework and childcare, right? So, like, um, there is a stronger association between male earnings and like women's adjustment to their housework and childcare time than there is between women's earnings and men's willingness to adjust. And I think that goes back to what you were just saying about status. So we culturally devalue traditionally feminized work, whether professional work in feminized occupations, which tend to be underpaid, relative to sort of masculine type occupations, or whether we're talking about housework and childcare that's domestic. We undervalue it, we underpay it, or we don't pay it at all. We don't include unpaid labor as part of the GDP. And so it's not just that women themselves don't feel like it's valuable, it's that our society has deemed it relatively less valuable work. And I think that's a reason that even if men are being out earned by their partners, they still don't want to engage in an equal split of housework and childcare because it's considered low status work that threatens their masculinity. And that to me is the problem that we need to solve. The problem that we need to solve is how we value care. And I think part of how we value care is actually by seeing it as work that is appropriate for men and congruent with masculinity, appropriate for men to do as well. And, you know, like we as humans spent 95% of our time on the planet living as hunter gatherers, where both males and females contributed to what we would consider to be the domestic sphere, including supervision of children. It's only really post-industrial revolution that we've split the sort of work world away from the work of the home in this like very polarized way. That I think you start to see like the work of the home is not remunerative, therefore not considered valuable, whereas the work of the marketplace is considered to hold value. And I think that is a problem because it means that kids, who are the most important, sources of our future prosperity, are underinvested in. And I think this problem is worse in the United States than it is in other industrialized democracies, but it's a problem globally that women's unpaid care work is undervalued and does not receive appropriate status.
Do you think that it's possible that in a more egalitarian world where men do more of their fair share of the housework contributions, do you think it's possible that some of the time the degree to which they engage in the contributions cannot actually be measured by the degree to which they find it cognitively laborious?
Say that again. Like, what does that mean?
Like, you know how we talked a little bit more like in the past about how much cognitive labor is like a useful measure for like how much someone has positively contributed. So if men engage in far like you know how men tend to be far more techno optimists than women, like they tend to be supportive of new technology like AI a lot
Yeah.
more. If they were to engage in these contributions to a greater extent, but they did so in a way that like made use of technology to a much greater extent as a way to outsource what would have been burdensome, do you think that there might be a disparity between how much they contribute and the degree to which that is measured by things like cognitive labor metrics?
Right, because you're saying that maybe if men are doing more housework and childcare, they'll come up with more efficient systems, or they'll be more willing to innovate technologically in ways that maybe circumvent some of the cognitive load. Is that what you're saying?
Sort of, yeah. If there, I think there might be something I might want to expand on in the future, but let's use that as like a starting baseline.
Yeah, I mean, I think the techno optimism piece is interesting, right? Like, is it because women are, inherently suspicious of technology, or is it because technology has not served women's needs very well, right? Given that venture capitalists are, I think, 90% male, and most companies are run by men. And that there are some real blind spots in our algorithms around, women's needs and women's bodies. So I think the techno optimism thing, like there maybe is some good reason for women to be less optimistic. But I think if men are able to step up and do more housework and childcare, and they come up with ways to do it with less cognitive load, excellent. More power to them. And I salute them, and they should do it well. I don't necessarily want to live in a future where we have robot nannies changing our kids' diapers. I do think that like some childcare actually just does really require human connection and patience and time and sustained investment. So I think there are some ways things you can't really hack your way out of, but I think there are plenty of frontiers where we could probably save labor. And in fact, we've already advanced. Like we didn't have vacuum cleaners or dishwashers, you know, however many generations ago, and doing housework used to be an all day time consuming task.
Yeah. So maybe if we can like I can ask you more personal questions.
Yeah.
What was household labor like when your dad was just like a single parent after the divorce? Like when you were spending time with him, what was it like for him to do allocation of labor? And why do you think he found that a lot easier like after he had to do all of it himself in like compared to like delegating responsibility between himself and someone else?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think so. Part of this is just personality stuff and like people's own sort of histories and preferences. Like, my dad is just a naturally neat person, and he actually likes cleaning up. He's one of those weird people that finds it relaxing to clean up. And so he likes cleaning the kitchen from top to bottom. And,
Like he didn't view it as labor?
I mean, I don't think it was like his number one favorite thing to do over and above any other hobbies, but like he didn't mind doing it and found it somewhat relaxing. And my husband these days is actually like the main kitchen cleaner and laundry folder, and sometimes he grumbles about it, but he also frequently listens to a podcast, and like it's sort of like takes some time to himself while he's doing it. So like I think people come up with ways to make these tasks more pleasant. Um, but so, like my dad's house was always like a little bit neater, a little less cluttered. My mom is kind of like me. I'm like a little bit of a clutter maximalist. Like you can tell even just like looking at my background, I have a lot of stuff. I'm like, you don't even want to see my desk, which is where I'm sitting. I just tend to like just have a lot of things around me, and I'm not very neat. And so her house was like always a little bit more chaotic. So the vibe was different, but a lot of that was driven not so much by gender roles, but just by kind of personality and predilection.
Yeah. Um, what specific aspects of his personality allowed him to feel like household work was easier when he was not sharing it with someone else?
I mean, I think he, because he's somebody that likes routine and sort of like orderliness and calm. I think having it just be like a meditative solo thing was more relaxing for him than arguing with somebody over it. And I think that's actually kind of similar to my husband's approach too.
Maybe he was like maybe it became more relaxing because if he felt like he was doing it with a partner, that partner might engage in a lot of maternal gatekeeping and like be a bit more like arbitrarily insistent about what he was doing right or wrong, because of like certain neurotic tendencies. Do you think that would be possible?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think my mom actually has like somewhat lower standards for housework than my dad, but she does actually really like to load the dishwasher. She's really good at that. But I think that like the sort of like somebody else is monitoring like the activity you're doing and wanting you to do it to their specifications is something that can be a source of conflict in a lot of couples. And like one thing that I think is really helpful for division of labor, and this is something actually I've collaborated with Eve Rodsky, who wrote the book Fair Play. She has talked about this a lot. Like the thing you need is ownership. Like if you're going to do a task, let's say groceries, you own the whole task from start to finish. You know what everybody needs, what supplies we're running out of, and you're the person that goes to the store. The worst thing to do is what she calls rats, like randomly assigned tasks, like, like, oh, can you get me like I don't know, a thing of flour because I'm baking. Just like going out and getting one thing at a time or arbitrarily being asked to grab a bunch of stuff. Because then it's like you don't actually, you're not part of the full picture and you're not part of planning and you don't own it. So it's sort of better if you're going to do housework that you just do the whole thing, which includes the mental part, the planning part. A lot of couples are sort of delegating constantly on the fly, but no one's actually in charge of the activity, which creates like a diffusion of responsibility that leads to a lot of discord.
Yeah, so I think maybe the explanation is that your friend Eve Rodsky created this like card game that is meant to like be about like allocation of like household responsibilities and stuff like that. Could you talk about the criticisms that your friend Lyman Stone has about the card game Fair Play?
Yeah, I mean, I should say Lyman Stone is actually one of my favorite writers on Substack. I think he's really smart, and I like reading all his sort of demography work. I really respect his methodologies. But he and I are politically and very opposite. He's in a much more traditional marriage, and I think is more comfortable with sort of really traditional gender roles, in part maybe coming from a more religious tradition. And so he is just not a fan of the sort of bean counting aspect. And I think that's something that Fair Play gets a lot of criticism for, which is like the idea that you're having to track and monitor who's doing what card and having to trade cards. It sort of just creates the wrong incentives.
Or like Lyman's perception is that that was introduced as a way for one person with more cards to passive aggressively shame the person with fewer cards, which I guess I don't think he would say this, but the subtext that from his criticism is like that person who is passive aggressively shamed tends to be male more often.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a good sort of summation of the criticism. I mean, to me, it's like the reason you're wanting to do the card game is because something's not going well in the relationship, right? Like someone or maybe both people are unhappy with the division of labor and the conversations about it don't feel productive. So it's like anything else, it's a tool. It's designed to facilitate better, more problem solving oriented conversations. And I think people sort of like look at the stack of cards and just feel like it's very transactional. But my problem with that argument is I just think like there's a lot of bourgeois mystification around like sort of women's work in particular because it has all this ineffable value and payoff. Like we should never try to count it or track it. And I think that actually works against what we were saying earlier around like this kind of work is just really devalued because it's not remunerative and we're in a culture that tends to really value things that it can assign a monetary value to. And I think that's actually really bad because that it means no one wants to do it and men don't want to do it and women don't want to do it and everybody's resenting when they have to do it, they're unhappy about it. And that's not good. It's not good for kids. It's not good for the household, for the climate of the household. So I actually think like it starts with just thinking like this work is really important and you need it to run a really functional, like harmonious household. And we're on a team, we're collaborators. And like I think Lyman's frame is that it's immediately going to be like contentious as soon as you start breaking out the cards. I think it's the opposite. To me, the cards are there as a tool to help you not fight in the moment, but rather have a more planful conversation so that you can arrive at a balance that feels mutually agreeable to both partners. It's supposed to build you like a more collaborative relationship. And again, it goes back to that idea that if you're holding a card, you own the whole thing from start to finish, the conception, the planning, and the execution, so that there is no need to nag or track somebody else's contributions or police someone or monitor someone. Like if I trust that like I make dinner, it's my husband's job to clean the kitchen. I would never like watch him do it, criticize him, tell him he's doing it wrong, tell him to do it differently. Like it's his thing. Like that, I just think you have to let people own their own thing. And one thing that goes wrong in a lot of marriages is when people feel like they have to monitor each other and sort of like judge each other. That can become like a real source of negative interaction.
Do you see merit to Lyman's critique? I don't think he explicitly phrased this as gendered, but I once again I think this is the subtext that like there was something intentional about how like where he created a spreadsheet. He logged all the cards and like how many hours slash minutes it takes. Do you think that there's like merit to his like subtextual critique that there is something gendered about the amount of time that each of those cards takes relative to like other ones?
Yeah, totally. And I actually think that's a really legitimate criticism. So, and I've heard that from other people too, that like the fair play cards, they're created by a woman. She crowdsourced a lot of info. She talked to a lot of other women. Um, like certain domestic tasks are very thin sliced. So, like it's very granular for certain tasks, and then for other tasks like yard work, it's like one card, right? So, I think that's also dependent on where you live and like how intensive your yard work needs to be or home maintenance. Like those things can be like more or less burdensome, sort of depending on your context. If you're in an apartment, maybe not, this isn't a card that you need to hold. I think that's the other thing, by the way, is like you sort of have to start with the idea that you're going to prune the deck and only focus on the cards that matter. So you're not necessarily going to need to divvy up every card. So I've also seen a lot of criticism of the system saying that like some cards, I don't know, there's one that got a lot of flack that was like interior decorating or something like that. I forget. I think it was like purchasing furniture. But it's like that's not a card you have to hold unless maybe you're renovating your house or something. You just wouldn't have it in your deck. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not Eve Rodsky, so she can probably defend it better than I can. I just got sucked in because I think it's gotten a lot of criticism that I think is somewhat unfair from people that haven't really tried to use it in good faith. But to me, it's a system that can be helpful for couples that are having problems with division of labor issues.
Yeah, and it also has the potential to be unhelpful if it is used in a context that is meant to provide any sort of judgment to the other partner.
As can any system, really, right? Like you can use anything with ill intent and use it to sow more discord.
Yeah. What would you say have been some of the most rewarding experiences that you've had when it came to doing research about fatherhood and like the experience of seeing other people become fathers or like seeing other like fathers look back on what it was like to raise children after the fact?
Yeah, it's been wonderful, like getting to talk to dads. I interviewed dozens of dads for the book, just like with a real variety of different kinds of experiences, adoptive dads, biological dads, dads with different kinds of work experiences. So it was really cool to just like get the perspective on the transformative power of fatherhood from a lot of different men. And then in terms of looking in my lab, it's been a pretty fascinating sort of scientific journey, just seeing the fact that the brain actually does change in men becoming parents in measurable ways, in ways that track with some of the changes that we see in women, but that are different in some ways. That we can find measurable changes in men's hormones around the transition to parenthood. I think work like that is interesting to me because it kind of reminds us that we're essentially animals. We think that we're like these sophisticated, humans with our computer-like brains, but we're also basically primates, and we're driven by, some of the same biology that drives other organisms on the planet.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a danger of not being sufficiently cognizant about the ways that we are essentially animals driven by like certain biological needs or desires?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think when we think about taking care of babies, like we were talking about, can you sort of like AI your way out of a lot of domestic responsibilities? Like the thing that I think is cool about babies and young kids is that they're actually like the opposite of smartphones. They're not actually designed to sort of capture and entrance us at all times. They exist on their own time scale. And like sort of like communing with a baby is actually, I think, something that everybody should spend more time doing. I'm actually writing my Substack about that this week. So, yeah, I mean, I think, we think that we can sort of like logic our way out of things, but essentially, like, we have drives, and some of those drives include the drive to reproduce, and to create a sense of legacy. And I think that's one reason that studying fatherhood is so interesting to me.
And that reminds me of another quote that you had about when it comes to babies and how they're very much not like computers. And maybe this is an area where dads are unique, where you said, quote, Dads might be a more relaxed presence at bedtime. Studies find that fathers are often not as vigilant or anxious about their infant's sleep as mothers are. They are less likely to endorse statements like, "My child will feel abandoned if I don't respond immediately to her cries at night," and "If I try to resist child's demands at night, then she will get more upset." Babies may pick up on that laid back attitude and sleep better as a result. So that laid back attitude, do you think that might be causally related to the fact that dads have lower standards for things that like moms tend to be exasperated at them for?
Yeah, I do think that. So I think yeah, it's interesting that you pull that out, like as part of the chapter on sleep. We know that when dads are more involved at bedtime, babies actually, there's some data suggesting that babies sleep better. So I think it's a good example of where, like, having a parent who is on the scene who isn't necessarily socialized by this like high judgment sort of culture that we have right now around parenthood is actually like a refreshing and sort of like welcome experience for kids and for the family. Like I think that's a good argument for why we need more dads in the world. In some ways, they're more free from the kind of like panopticon of judgment that besieges our moms.
Yeah, and maybe like this is one area where a lot of the time people might complain about dads or men having lower standards in a relationship when it comes to things like the type of labor that it would take, like require to take care of kids, where maybe that those lower standards are actually a net positive in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mixed bag. It can be both a net positive and a net negative. Like, I think there's some cases where you want lower standards because we're just too intensive and we've made our lives too difficult. There are other cases where, like the example of like forgetting that you need to bring a present to a birthday party where your kid could actually be ostracized because like you didn't do that mental load thing, or forgetting to book summer camps and then your kid is just home playing video games all day, which probably isn't great for their brain. So, I think it's a mix, right? Some things we probably give too much importance to, and other things we probably don't spend enough time on.
Are there any times where you worry that you put too much importance on one thing relative to another?
Oh, absolutely. All the time. I mean, I think being a parent of kids, my kids are teenagers now, you're always second guessing your instincts. Like, my daughter's a junior in high school right now, so I'm always stressing about her college stuff. And to the point where she's like asked me to stop talking to her about it because I think I've stressed her out now. And that's a place where I probably should have backed off like a year ago. But it's like I'm bringing my own anxiety to the table. So, and I think parents end up doing a lot of that kind of like misstep.
Yeah, so maybe that's another positive contributions that dads could have when it comes to being with their kids is that they might bring up things that like they might parent in a way that like causes their kids to have less anxiety. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, there actually is some evidence that dad's style of play is linked with reduced risk of anxiety in kids. So, kids do benefit from greater exploration, more risk taking. So, I think there are certainly anxious dads who are making their kids more anxious, but I think in general, the sort of socialized style that fathers have is more conducive to building kids' confidence.
What role models do you think men have the potential to look at when it comes to positive examples of fathers in society?
Yeah, it's a great question. I talk a little bit about this in the book, like like our TV dads are frequently portrayed as sort of bumbling and hapless, and we
Or
don't
they're
actually.
they're frequently the butt of the joke. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, like humorously foolish. They're not always like seen as like strong authority figures. And that's sort of in keeping with our overall sort of questioning of authority kind of in this the, in this century. So like we don't have as many great role models of good parents, right, as I think we could. I certainly think on both sides of the political aisle, there are good role models. Like I think Barack Obama was very hands-on dad. I think there are conservative men who are also really great dads. I think I don't know, I talk about this in the book, but like the Mandalorian who's like running around with Baby Yoda and taking care of Grogu. is I think a really like manly model, but of a very nurturing caregiver. I think that's one reason that show was such a hit.
Do you think
Is
like he channels traditionally like male coded traits like aggression or toughness in like a positive direction? Is that
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why that show resonated so much with people, or why it was so popular, is because he was sort of like this kind of like stereotype of like the very strong, silent man, like covered in armor, but also with like had this gentleness and like care for this vulnerable little creature that I think does provide like a template for masculinity that also has room to nurture.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe as we've spent so much time talking about all the different facets of fatherhood and like all the potential for what an aspirational vision of fatherhood might look like. Um, what could you ta tell me maybe some like personal anecdotes you've heard that have like reinforced how much potential there is for fatherhood to grow and evolve over time?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to a lot of dads who just said that, becoming a parent was one of the most meaningful parts of their lives and a huge sense of purpose. So, one person I interviewed for the book was Tommy Viator, who's a correspondent with Pod Save America, former White House security advisor. And he lost his first child to stillbirth after having had a series of miscarriages. And so he had a very difficult transition into fatherhood. But he told me, now that he has two kids who are doing well, it's really changed his sense of empathy and like changed his appraisals of world events. Like he's a professional sort of commentator on the news, but he's become much more sympathetic to any situations where kids are vulnerable. So I think that's a good example of how fatherhood or parenthood can change us in a way that makes us more attuned to, what other people need, and just like how to be kinder and better humans.
Darby Saxbe, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this question.
This was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Andrew.
I have to be honest, I had like another like 30 questions about like pronatalism and feminism and the effect that it had on men. But that was like such a good interview ender that maybe we'll just end there and hopefully I can talk to you again later this year about all the other stuff. Uh,
I would love to. Yeah,
yeah.
anytime.
See you.